We're looking forward to your presentation.
Can you hear me? Ah, look at that. Don't you love speaking someplace where you have a audio tech who actually knows what he's talking about? It's great. Hi, I'm going to have to do this really fast. So I have about 18 hours of stuff to talk about and 20 minutes to do it. Chris Norris said, I said, do you want my bio to do whatever? And he said, no, I introduced you 3 years ago and I'm not going to do it again. So let me just give you a little bit of my background, because some of you have, are from the new club or the other club that have joined us. And I know I did. You can't help slamming him. So anyway, I'm Meredith Woodruff. I'm from Stillwater. I grew up here, went to high school here and OSU. Joined the CIA largely because my husband, who is also a Stillwater guy, had been recruited. I came in as one of the first women in operations in the CIA and became a spy, served with my husband this is a different husband than this one, an earlier version of, yes. This is the better version. I served in Russia and was a Soviet specialist, both of us were. In Russia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Europe until 1993, when my husband was assassinated by the Russians as the senior CIA officer in what was then the former Soviet Union. I stayed in, was pulled back from overseas to build our recruitment center, recruiting new officers. We had a need to recruit many more than we ever had before because of world situations. Went back overseas, was pulled back again after 9/11 to head Europe. So I was the chief of Europe for the CIA after 9/11 as we built the counterterrorism coalition with the European intelligence services. I did some other things I don't talk about, and then retired as the senior woman in the CIA and in operations for the United States. Came back here many years later to recapture my childhood, I guess. I don't know, to be part of Stillwater, which I love. I'm giving you that because I want to say what I'm going to talk about today, I know something about. But also because I want to talk today from the perspective of an intelligence officer. I want to talk about the Ukraine. It is something that I think we all should be aware of and should know a little bit more than just what you see every day. And so to look at this really with any kind of understanding, you need to try to understand the mindset of another intelligence officer. And that would be Putin, the president of the Soviet Union. This is his war. It is only his war. It is not a war of the Russian military or the Russian people at all. Putin was a KGB officer, as many of you know, and he defines himself always when he introduces himself and when he speaks, he defines himself as a Chekist. And the Cheka was the first intelligence service under the new communist regimes under Lenin. They were as brutal as any intelligence security service in the world has ever been. And their purpose was to maintain their administration, their control over what became the Soviet Union, and they would do anything to ensure that you call it stability, but stability of power. And Putin, defining himself as a Cheka, standing up in front of the Russian people and saying, "That's who I am," means don't screw with me, or basically I'll do away with you. And we're seeing that more and more now in Russia, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I also want to make that point to you that this is his war. It is a matter of ego. It is a matter of power for him. He is what we call a personalist autocrat. Yeah, does that make sense? I got to have head shakes or yeah, or, you know, you all are staring at me like, what? So give me some reaction here. So he's an autocrat. Yeah. Yeah. And he has absolute power in Russia right now. He said recently, a couple of years ago, he said the greatest tragedy of the last century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he abides by that. And he has said his sole purpose is to reunite the Soviet Union under some kind of, maybe not the Soviet Union, but under some kind of agreement that pulls all of those, what we call the independent states, together again. Okay. So I'm going to put a map up here. Oh, my little thing here. Garrett, I'm going to put a map up here and I want you to look at this as we talk. Can you see it? Can you see it back there? Okay, so there's the Ukraine, Soviet, all the Soviets, Russia over here. But I want you to notice Belarus and then the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Now, they are now part of NATO, those three countries, and Poland, right? Belarus is stuck with Putin. They are big supporters, the biggest supporters of Putin. And we'll talk about why that is important and that geography is important. So let me just leave that up there for a minute. I want to give you some background about the Ukraine that you may or may not be aware of. The Ukraine in the Soviet Union has been always a competitor in terms of productivity and population with the Russian state. Yeah. And look where it is. It is the most westward leaning of, because Poland was not part of the Soviet Union, right? It was part of the Eastern Bloc, but not Soviet Union. It was the most westward located of the states, and always had that not a balance at all, but always had factions in it that faced west as well. When Stalin came to power, he was jealous of that. He hated the Ukrainians, and from the get-go did everything he could to control them and make sure that they did not outreach the Russian state, although he was a Georgian, not outreach the Russian state in terms of productivity. During the post-World War II era in the 50s, and what's Ukraine's big claim to fame? What is their major export? Absolutely, the biggest wheat producers anywhere other than the United States. In fact, Poland right now is complaining because they also have a big wheat industry, and Ukraine is shipping all of its grain to Poland and has basically done away with the Polish wheat product right now because it's so far outstripping it. But anyway, during the 1950s, Stalin basically starved to death 2 or 3 million Ukrainians because he taxed them so heavily. He took the grain to use for the rest of the country, but he levied taxes on the Ukrainians that literally made them unable to purchase food. And we estimate between 2 and 3 million Ukrainians died because of Stalin. Then Khrushchev came to power. And Khrushchev had been the governor he was not from the Ukraine, but had been the governor of the Ukraine and really favored them in all kinds of policies. And so when he became governor, he restored that ability to produce wheat and for them to become more productive and get back into kind of any kind of lifestyle at all. And he gave them the Crimea. Now, can you see the Crimea up here? It is that it's probably labeled, I can't see it, but it's that little peninsula that hangs down. It had always been part of Russia, but Khrushchev, as his de-Stalinization step, gave the Crimea to the Ukraine. So from the late 1950s, when Khrushchev took over, the Crimea belonged to the Ukraine. So you move ahead, and in 91, when the Gorbachev basically gave away the Soviet Union and it dissolved, Ukraine became an independent state, as did all of the republics. And it really started moving toward the West. And in fact, its first election was an election of a president that ran on the policy of, I'm going to join NATO, I'm going to join the EU, and we are going to boost our cost of living, our standard of living, and we're going to turn to the West. Well, that did not make Yeltsin at the time happy. Yeltsin, if you'll remember, appointed Putin as his deputy, as his assistant when he was president. Putin had left the KGB when he saw Gorbachev come to power and became a politician, basically, because he thought, with this liberalization that Gorbachev is going to put us through, KGB will not be what it used to be. We can't be the strong arm of the state. And so he became a politician. He curried favor with Yeltsin. Yeltsin made him his deputy. Yeltsin stepped down, of course, earlier than we thought he would. I'll just tell you this, because he was a drunk, he was an alcoholic, and he was basically unconscious most of the time. So Putin then became the acting president, and then the Russian state had an election, free and fair election, and Putin was elected president. He stayed president as long as he could for 2 terms. And when he could no longer do that, he named his deputy, Medvedev, who had been mayor of St. Petersburg, where Putin was from. He named him as president, and Putin then became prime minister. But when he did that, he basically was controlling Medvedev. It was basically his puppet. Did that for 4 more years, ran again for president, and then changed the constitution, allowing him to be president for life. So there we are. So back in the Ukraine, after the dissolution, you saw a period up until 2009, of this switch back and forth between a president who, the first one who said, I'm turning us to the West, Russia then coming in and saying, let's have another election, controlling that election and putting into power one of their own guys. The people of Ukraine standing that for about 3 years, having a revolution and overthrowing the Soviet-backed or the Russian-backed president, electing a Western-leaning one, and having that go through again. If you remember when the Russians poisoned Yevchenko, who was elected in a free and fair election to be president, this handsome man, and then you saw him and remember that he was totally different. He was poisoned by the Putin's guys. So, and we know that because we know who did it. So then in 2009, there was another election, and a Western-leaning guy was elected, but like all of his previous predecessors, he was corrupt. And I mean, there is no corruption like Russian Soviet corruption. That whole era, of course, was the Soviet Union was nothing but corrupt leadership, and this guy took the cake. So he was in power. Well, he was in power when in 2014, Putin decided he wanted the Crimea back. Remember that? He went into the Crimea very quickly, moved his own troops in there, and annexed it, declared annexation. Well, Poroshenko was president, and even though he was Western leaning, things were so corrupt. There was not really the will of the Ukrainian people to do anything about it. So the annexation was allowed. We were coming out of those last throes of Afghanistan and Iraq, and we were not interested, nor was the EU interested in engaging in another battle in any kind of sense. So he took the Crimea pretty easily. But at the same time, now look at that map. See how kind of think about the Ukraine in maybe in fifths, and that eastern fifth that borders, that's kind of sticks out, that borders Russia, is we refer to as the Donbass. There are 4 oblasts or states there, and it's an industrial part, but it is the lowest standard of living in the Ukraine. And it has a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians anyway. But what Putin started doing in 2014, when he took the Crimea, was to start moving Russian-speaking folks from Russia into that and letting them settle there. A couple years later, they demanded to have a referendum on joining, leaving the Ukraine and joining Russia. The Ukrainian government said, not on your life, we're not going to listen to any kind of referendum, even though they did have it, and they did vote to go back with Russia. The Ukrainian government wouldn't allow it. So in 2019, you had to look too at the media in the Ukraine, because they have a great, they make movies and TV shows. They had a great TV show. Their most popular TV show was a sitcom called The Servant of the People. And if you've seen it, you can pull it up on YouTube. Of course, you can pull anything up on YouTube. It was a very funny show with this young comedian, smart, young, handsome guy, who played the part of a high school teacher who is so smart and so popular that his students and the families of his students convince him to run for president, and he's elected and he becomes president of Ukraine. His name was Zelensky. And that's exactly what he did as a comedian. And who are we to complain about having actors or people on TV to become presidents who know nothing about politics or the world order? But he was very political, had been involved in politics, had been a radio talk show, was very charming and smart as can be, and a real heroic figure, as it turns out. And he became president of the Ukraine. And he said, not only are we turning to the West, but we're getting rid of corruption. And really started putting his foot down and not allowing it to happen. So when last February, Putin showed up, he said, we're not going to do it. Came to the West, asked for help, and he said, we cannot allow this, because he takes the Ukraine, and what happens? Look at that map. I want Americans to look at that map. He owns Belarus. There is nothing between the Ukraine and the rest of Europe that's going to stop him. We talk about, you'll hear a lot of Americans complain about, oh, well, we don't want to give all that money. We're giving way too much money to Ukraine. We are giving this, so far in the Biden administration, 5.6% of our defense budget has gone to the Ukraine. When we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was hugely bigger than that. So let's not even listen to that that argument. You can have some other arguments. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so that's what we give. But look up there at the Baltic states plus Poland. We give 0.01% of our GDP to the Ukraine right now. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are giving, like, in some cases, 15% of their GDP to arm Ukraine. Because there's nothing. Yesterday, Putin moved tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. Why? Look at the map. Where is Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine? Right in the north central part, right over the border from Belarus. Tactical nukes there, as of yesterday. Okay, so where are we? Right now, the Russians came in February of 22, and they immediately took a lot of territory. They took almost all of the Donbass, and they took some areas around Kyiv. The Ukrainians now have pushed back on that. They took about 20% of the Ukraine, the Russians did. They pushed back, and as of yesterday morning, they have about 16%, and it's all in the east. So the Ukrainians have taken back all of that area around Kyiv. Okay, so now they're still in the east, and they are outside of this town, which is strategically not important, but politically it's very important. I don't know if you've been following this. They've been at this almost a stalemate now for 7 months. Here's what Russia's doing, though. They have the Russian military that is not trained very well, equipped, and this is a big question right now that I see our military asking. Russians, went into Syria and helped Assad. They were really high in using technological equipment and state-of-the-art kinds of things. They're not doing that in the Ukraine. So it's a question as to why they're not, and I don't have the answer to that. But for 7 months now, they've been stalemated in this town. And the Russians are throwing people at it. Now, they don't have a big standing army, right? So what did Putin do? He conscripted about 300,000 new soldiers. But he also is using, and up until about 2 months ago, he said, oh, no, they're not part of the official Russian. He's also using a group called I call it the Wagner group, the Wagner group, headed by a guy named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is, they call him Putin's chef. He started as a hot dog stand owner in Moscow, but built up his restaurants and all of that, and his financial holdings. And he started this paramilitary group. And the Russians, Putin used him in Syria and in Africa, doing all kinds of things, really bad guy things. They are, oh, okay. I have to quit, but let me just finish this and then we'll do questions. But this Wagner group is ruthless. They are murderers. They have about, right now in this town, they've taken about 60% of the town, but it is stalemated. They have about 6,000 of the Wagner group, and Putin has allowed them to go into the prisons and pull out in Russian prisons, pull out anybody. So what Prigozhin did personally was he went into the big prison. There are about 8 great big prisons in around the Moscow area. And he said, okay, guys, you have a choice. You can come fight with us and I have no guarantees. You will, live or die. Can't give you any training, but you'll be out of prison. So come and fight with us. And he brought about 30,000 prisoners out of prison to eastern Ukraine, and they are the folks right now who are working with the Soviet military or the Russian military to fight the Ukrainians. Prigozhin is another big ego, and he is in a fight with the Russian military. We like that because it splits them, it splits the command. He is blaming the Russian command right now for not giving him the weapons and the ammunition that he wants. One more thing before we go to questions. Russia is basically what we look at as a failing state. Their economy is going down the tubes, even though their oil markets are still good because China and India are helping them with buying petroleum. But their population is declining very rapidly. Their average male lifespan is 62 years old, largely due to alcoholism. I would drink too if I had to live there. But it is a failed state. One of the reasons Putin is staying with this war and keeping it going is it is a distraction from what's going on internally. He has also cut out, they arrested, did you see they arrested an American journalist this morning? You remember yesterday, I don't know if you saw, yesterday we arrested a GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. We arrested a GRU officer who was pawning himself off as a Brazilian graduate student and got into Johns Hopkins foreign policy program in Washington, D.C. But as it turns out, he was somebody else, and he's really a Russian GRU. We made a big deal about arresting him. The next day, what does Putin do? Because he can't have his people looking at that. So what does he do? He arrests a journalist who was doing basically nothing, American journalist. So now we'll add that to the group that the Russians are holding of Americans. So it is in Putin's favor to keep this war going on as long as possible. He believes we will get tired of it. And you're seeing Republicans in the House and Senate talking about that. He believes that Europe, the EU will get tired of paying for that war. And so he will continue it as long as he can. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, want this over with. They only have limited number of people. However, the rate of Russian deaths compared to Ukrainian deaths is 1 to 7. 7 Russians are being killed in the Ukraine for every one single Ukrainian that's being killed. So, the Ukrainians say, let's get this over with. They know if Russia wins the war, that'll be the end of the war, but it'll also be the end of Ukraine. They cannot exist if Russia wins the war, because he will take it all back, and that will be the end of that. So there are some things I want you to look at, and that's all I'm here to say. Make a judgment for yourself. Look at that map. Know that if he takes the Ukraine, it will not stop. It will go on. That's the other thing. I have a lot of Americans who say, well, why don't we just go in? Why don't we just move the military in? Because he has said one step of NATO into this territory, because the Ukraine is not a NATO member. And so Article 5 of the NATO agreement does not apply to them. If we take one step into the Ukraine, that means that Putin then would be in the world view allowed then to hit back at NATO members. And who's right there? Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So that's the big, the big decision here. Do we go in or do we not go in? And we have said we will not go in because of the danger that will mean to Poland. One thing I want you to look at is China's role in all of this. Xi, president of China, was in Moscow for 3 days last week. We didn't know what he was going to do. We hoped that it would not end in an agreement for China to provide military hardware to Russia, and it did not. China did not do that. We have been very clear to China in no uncertain terms. You know, you do not do that or we will sanction trade. One of the things they did talk about, and then I think there are economists in this room that know more about this than I do, but one thing that they have started to talk about is creating a banking and money moving system based on the yuan instead of the dollar, and what that would do to the world economy. If it would certainly allow Iran, China, Russia to get around sanctions if they could use the yuan instead of the dollar for trade. That's an important thing to look at. So let's watch what happens in Congress to see what they decide to do. You know, we have said we will not send planes in for two reasons. The planes that they want from us are so advanced, even though they're not our most advanced, but they are the generation prior to that. That would take a while for the Ukrainians to not only learn to fly, but to maintain. And if we have to maintain them, that means we have to go in there, which we will not do. Okay, so that's one issue. Another issue, right, that look it up because it's fascinating, is this has become a drone war. The Iranians are providing drones to the Ukraine. You know, the Russians shot down our big drones that were gathering intel information. That's something now we're having to recalibrate. But it is drone against drone, which is really very interesting, particularly since OSU is the big drone school. So, you know, we'll see how that goes. So anyway, that's what I want you to watch. I want you to watch China. I want you to watch what our folks do. I want you to watch the outcome of this war in Bakhmut right now, this town that they are in, because it is Putin needs a win. He has not had a win. He's lost the territory that he'd already gained. So now what's going to happen if he loses that? Very few autocrats stay in power if they start a war and they lose that war. You're seeing protests in Moscow. He is aware of that, although he's shut off, you know, every Western access to Western media. It's an issue. The Russians are fighting for their lives. Let me just say one more thing. We have an analogy that I want you to think about in terms of foreign policy in general. Think about China as the way we look at climate change. Something we have to adapt to, something we have to change, something we have to handle. Think about Russia as a hurricane. It's something we have to deal with right now. So, comments, questions? Larry.
In your opinion, is there any chance that there might be an overthrow of Putin or an assassination?
You know, I've been really interested and surprised looking at reference now, you know, everybody that's writing about Ukraine all the time, really foreign policy people, how often they're talking about a potential overthrow. And as I said, you know, historically, autocrats who start a war and can't win it are ousted. It's another reason why he's happy to continue this war. I don't know. He surrounds himself. He is inaccessible. If he's going to be killed or ousted, it's going to have to be from his own people. And he's very careful who he surrounds himself with. Yes, Tim. No, he does not. Good autocratic behavior. No, he does not have a second. So there's no one And the reason why is because people around him then can't say, well, we'll just move old Vladimir in, No, he does not. And he purposefully does not. Yes.
Meredith, how seriously, excuse me, how seriously should we take the apparent split, or growing split between the Wagner Group and the Russian military? And how serious would that be to Russia if that happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting because if there is any public figure who has power that might ultimately be used against Putin, it is Prigozhin. It is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's head of the Wagner Group. He's very popular. He's won everything. He is also fighting for his life now in his persona, his popularity. So we'll see. I think, I think our military, Milley, our chief of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, said yesterday, we really need to watch this. We really need to watch this split. He said also we really need to watch the triangle with China, Ukraine, and Iran, and see how close that goes. Because if they start matching each other, providing weapons to each other over everything, then that's a big problem for us. So yeah, watch all of that. Yes.
So, what is this on? So, does Russia have a workaround for the Article 5 trigger? So let's say they want to take the Baltic states. That's going to trigger, all out NATO.
Yeah.
Going in. Are they looking for a workaround on that, or are they going to face that?
No, I think that would be he's not going to do that unless we step into it and into his territory. And he believes, or of course he says he believes, Ukraine is part of Russia, which is interesting because historically Russia was part of the Ukraine, the other way around. Yes. Yeah, I don't agree.
As concerned as the Congress is, Langford came out about the farmland being bought from China and Russia, because believe it or not, it's being bought. I see it in Payne County. And it's been a concern, and Congress is talking about it. What do you think that is? And what do you think the purpose is they're doing this? Or is it just to control us from our inside?
It's, again, it's what what I mentioned about, let's look at the analogy of China as the climate change. We're long past the post-Cold War era. We're in the era of competition right now. And our competitor is China. This is Russia, is a problem, but Russia's not going to be there forever. China will be. So yes, we should be concerned. Those of you who look at the new Silk Road, or the project of China in being able to control all ports, or certainly have ports and all transportation around the world. They've made it all the way now to the Persian Gulf, and they own it. What's interesting about Ukraine is you have 39 countries in the UN that would not vote against Russia's going into the Ukraine. Why is that? You have China, India, Brazil, Iran, big populations. More than half of the population of the earth will not take action against Russia, or even take a stand, or even say anything against it. So, where are we? It's Europe and the United States. And so you need to pay attention to what China's doing. I served many years, 8 years in Africa. We do nothing in Africa. That's 50 votes in the UN. China owns the resources of Africa, and they do it by building, any of you who served there, done whatever, been there, they do it by building resources, infrastructure for all of those countries. And then they say, you owe us. So they're all in debt to China, but they are not going to vote. They're going to watch China to see what it's doing in the UN. So yeah, be concerned about them. It's a world competition, us and them. Farmland is absolutely part of it. Yeah, we know how much we owe to China. Well, watch what they're buying, because they're doing it all over the world. I have to stop.
One other question, Meredith, based upon your personal opinion, would Putin use nuclear weapons and the ones that just?
If his back's to the wall, yeah, he will. He'll use anything. Yeah, but he's not going to do it unless we provoke him. You know, and a country needs to use its strength as a deterrent, not as a provocation. And that's where we're caught. You
Okay.
know, we don't want to provoke it. Thank you all.
Let's give Meredith a great big hand.